All right, welcome back. When it comes to the classical performing arts, support structures are fast disappearing as arts education is being squeezed out and classical performing has all but disappeared from television and radio. So to what extent is this a problem for attracting young and newer audiences? And just also picking up on what we were just talking about before the break, Perryn, I do wonder to what extent, I mean, generally speaking, when we're talking about fine arts, audiences do tend to skew older, though I agree, we're probably seeing a new generation of people coming into it, but the lion's share is older. And so to what extent is there sort of, nothing to worry about here, because this is an audience that will just sort of keep reproducing itself as people age?
Yeah, I mean, I'll speak about opera. That's very true. It's always been an older audience. But also it's true to say that the audiences have been declining for decades. As our lifestyles change, as we become less adept at, or less willing to say at 7:30 on Friday night for the next 12 weeks, I'm going to be at the same place. That's just a lifestyle change which has happened. There was no alternatives quite often to going to the theatre. There are now plenty of alternatives. You can stream things, you can start things when you want, when it's convenient to your timeline. So I think those changing habits are also massively impacting the performing arts, because we've been built on a subscription basis where you're committing to being the same place at least 6 times on a Friday night. And I think there's just generally a more time as you get older, in which you want to reflect on a little bit more thinking about yourself, asking questions about yourself, experiencing arts and performing arts in particular as you get older, and you have the time and resources to do it.
Time and resources, I mean, how much of it comes down to money?
I think this is why we see a lot of older audiences, because the disposable income and maybe kids moved out of the home allow people to more consistently go out to see things. But really, one of the things, and especially as we're talking about opera, if we look back at the history of opera, it had its beginnings in premieres. I mean, probably every week there would have been a new opera playing in all of the opera houses. That's something that we don't see very often. New works are few and far between. And so the art form has moved from a place of being new works that are sometimes failing, sometimes succeeding, to essentially canonical or historic works that we're performing more and more often. So I think in terms of seeing this next generation, it will be about rekindling something of that newness and stories that are relevant to our time and that are coming out of our moment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, it speaks to what I was saying, off the top, that is a field that is waking up, that is actually self-examining and realizing that we have to shake up things. We have to shake up what the performance ritual is. We've had a one-size-fits-all performance ritual for music that is spanning about 500 years. For so many different functions, so many different contexts, but the package is always the same. You come to the hall, you sit there quietly, there are people on stage, you clap at the right time, you don't clap at the wrong time, and then, and it's over. And this is for music that's written for the church, it's written for Louis XIV's bedroom, it's for all kinds of different things. So these are things that now people are finally changing the thinking around and the way that they present. And as that happens, that also can generate different interest.
I think some of those things are historically inaccurate.
Yes.
Opera was never, ever about coming in, house lights going down. It was a living, breathing piece of art.
Absolutely.
And everyone came in and went and got a drink or went to that kind of stuff. That all started after the Second World War, where people went, okay, this is now how we do opera.
Well, it became like going to church.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's all become like going to church.
Yeah.
I think that's a big part of, too, getting younger people on board is making this music relatable, like letting people know the stories of these great composers, and that really there was no difference from Bach sitting down, in front of his manuscripts than there is with, a prodigy today sitting in front of a computer with Ableton open and all the instruments. It's the same thing happening, just in a different era. A young person with a musical mind trying to capture emotions and use the tools that are available to them to create a great piece of work. And I think as you see more stories about that, I mean, look at the Johnny Cash phenomenon. But just before he passed, nobody really knew much about Johnny Cash in terms of my generation, right? I didn't know a lot of people that listened to him. He passed, the movie came out, everyone in the world is the biggest Johnny Cash fan. In a couple months, we're going to get Bradley Cooper's film about Leonard Bernstein. I'm curious to see if that'll have a similar impact. As you start telling these stories and making these historical figures a little bit more relatable. Beethoven, for example, is one that is a familiar story to a lot of people, and as a result, people do seem to gravitate towards his work a bit more. I mean, never mind, he is the greatest composer of all time, but...
But I am interested in a point you made earlier about being trained by constant exposure, because I would argue that back in the 70s and 80s, there were some great pop artists that were making classical music modern. I mean, you could hear sort of, Queen has a very orchestral sound, Electric Light Orchestra, Meatloaf had an entire rock opera album. And so to some extent, people were being exposed to it, but does that translate into bums and seats in concert halls, or is it sort of at the peril of the traditional classics? What do you think?
Yeah, what I also find interesting in this conversation is that right now in our 22-23 season, the box office leaders right now are the big classic ballets. It's Nutcracker, it's Cinderella, and it's Romeo and Juliet. So far outperforming everything else on the season. And that, it's sort of interesting to me because there is an interest in new work and there is a demand for that, but there still is a tremendous demand for the classical ballet canon. And if we look at Swan Lake this past June, a lot of our older audience did stay home because they were still a bit nervous about the pandemic. Yet we were sold out every night for 16 shows at the Four Seasons Center, and it was a young audience. There were a lot of young people in the audience. And so I'm incredibly hopeful. I think there is a generation that is hungry for what we do, and they're not only hungry for the new stuff, but they're hungry for all of it, and that's really encouraging.
But look how many of the symphony orchestras have started to do these incredible John Williams scores, Hans Zimmer scores. I mean, the Harry Potter series of concerts are incredible. You watch the film, you have live, you can easily forget there is a live orchestra there, but some of them have chorus as well, and it's like, that's an introduction to, oh, okay, this isn't quite what I thought it was.
Yeah.
And but you need that gateway in, don't you?
I also think there's an element too of, I'm a lifelong music fan, and it took me a while to get to classical music, but I think there is some merit to the notion that when you exhaust a genre, say you grow up loving classic rock, after a while, there's only so many ways you can analyze the Rolling Stones, who are still one of my favorite bands, but you're ready for something else, maybe something that's going to challenge you a little bit more. And so I think it is naturally a genre that people who have listened to music their entire lives do come into a little bit later in life, because it's maybe they have kids and they want it on in the car because it's for the whole family. Maybe they want to challenge themselves a bit more because after a while, you've seen every movie, you start going back to the classics. You've heard just about every modern rock and pop song. You want to go back to the classics.
That's an interesting point. All right, stick around. We'll be right back.